Good afternoon, everyone. If I haven't met you before, I'm Hilary Craiglow, and I lead library consulting for Attain Partners, which is a higher ed consulting firm. In addition to traditional management consulting, a good portion of my work focuses on the intersection of federal policy, institutional finance, and libraries. So specifically, I help institutions understand and demonstrate how libraries support organized research. That's research that is separately budgeted and accounted for. And I help institutions recover their investments in sponsored research that is funded extramurally. With me here today is my colleague Gil Tran, Cynthia Hudson, Vitale, and Tim McGeary. And I'm going to ask them in a minute to do some brief introductions. But I want to set the stage just a little bit first. Over this past year, we've seen incredible shifts in federal cost recovery policy, including the NIH's attempted 15% cap on indirect cost recovery. In response, new IDC or indirect cost model proposals, notably JAG's FAIR model, that's the Joint Association Group's Financial Accountability and Research model. These changes, or potential changes, really raise big questions for us in libraries. How can libraries demonstrate their impact on sponsored research? How can libraries position themselves for this potential new economic era or the new economic era that we're in? Support compliance and equity. So, and ultimately, how do we sustain the essential research support services that libraries provide under new economic conditions? So today's panel brings together three perspectives: deep federal policy expertise and institutional strategies from two major research universities. Our goal today is to start to unpack what these policy changes may mean, explore some opportunities for libraries to engage with the models, and ensure sustainability and access to our essential research information services under new economic conditions. So I'm going to start with Gil Tran. Gil, you bring a really unique vantage point as someone who spent 27 years in the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, shaping federal grants policy, and now you advise institutions navigating these changes. Could you introduce yourself a little bit and share what brought you to this work, especially the JAG FAIR model?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. I was instructed by Hilary here and by Paige, from CNI to say that, first of all, congratulations to all of you. This is the last session. This is the last session before, the grand finale when you with Deborah. So congratulations on that. And I'm pretty sure that your head is already filled up with all kind of information. If it's not by yourself, AI probably fill the rest of it for you. So congratulations on that. And so here we say, we got to make this session light and bright, right? Light and bright. Well, of course, sorry about that. I don't think when you talk about federal cost principles, indirect costs, charge out, is nothing going to be light. It's going to be bright probably, but it's not going to be light. Of course, my name is Gil. Thank you, Hilary, for the introduction. My last 27 years, I was with OMB. So anything that relate to federal fundings in terms of research, in terms of indirect or direct, go to our office. So I'm pretty familiar with that. Prior to that, I spent 3 years with Department of Health and Human Services, looking at the indirect cost proposal, where library cost is one of the components of indirect. So I have experience in that as well. And before that, I was with my boss here, Mark Davis, IKPMG. And in that position, we advise all the university on doing the indirect cost proposal, including the library study. But I'm proud to say that, I started out at Georgetown University, being in the grants office. And that's where, I manage, all the letter of credit drawdowns, all the indirect cost proposal and so on and so forth. But one thing I want to point out for you, my connection with library was when I was at Georgetown for 4 years, my sister was the administrative, manager for the library. So she and we carpool together, and every day every day would go back, and she would tell me on what her director, what library was doing, and I telling her what kind of grants we have. And I can tell you right now, the impression on librarian, they work pretty hard, but as the directors, she say he spent most of the time fundraising. That's he's out there trying to get the fundraising, trying to get those rare books that is being donated and stuff like that. So I know a little bit of library. How do I end up in jazz? I don't know you remember that. I don't know you remember that movie, Slumdog Millionaires. You remember all that, right? Won the Oscar, the best movie, and how Jamal answered all those questions, and it's all based on his live event. One of the questions was, they asked him to identify, who's on the $100 bills. Is that Abraham Lincoln's? Is that George Washington? Is that Franklin Roosevelt or Benjamin Franklin? And being in India, he got no idea, of the $100 bill, U.S. dollar bill, who's on that, except for one of his live events. He was a tour guy, and some American tourists gave him a $100 bill, and immediately he said Ben Franklin, and that was the right answer. The way I end up in Jack is a little bit like Jamal. With all the experience that I have in different things, I was lucky to be called in by Dr. Kevin Drockelmeyer, which I ran into when I was OMB, when he was the director of OSTP. He said that we are working on a big project. The call came in on Sunday, by the way, and said, Gil, we're working on a big project. We need you. And I feel like that, that is my moment. That's all the experience I accumulate, with Georgetown University, KPMG, HHS, and OMB lead me to this place. So I'm very honored, to be on there. So now I'm with Attain and excited to be, involved in this area.
Thank you. Cynthia, you recently moved to Hopkins from ARL, and I'm wondering if you could kind of talk about how that transition may have shaped some of your perspective on these issues.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Cynthia Hudson Vitale. I'm the Associate Dean for Technology, Strategy, and Digital Services at Hopkins. Been there about 16 months. Prior to that, I spent a number of years at ARL doing science policy work where we looked across looked nationally at different issues that were affecting research libraries and did some advocacy around it. And one of the key issues that we highlighted in my time there was around F&A and indirects. And so the transition for me, actually, when I moved from kind of doing the national level work into Hopkins, the transition really made visible for me how complex and kind of multi-layered policy implementation has become inside an institution of Hopkins size. So federal guidance is pretty straightforward in some ways. But by the time it moves through like research administration and departments and IT and labs, it takes on kind of multiple layers of interpretation. And these interpretations can often reflect like the needs of different parts of the university, but they also kind of create a landscape that researchers encounter differing support levels and differing options. And that can obviously also shape institutional exposure to kind of some of the uncovered cost or unrecovered costs. So just to kind of connect this a little bit, one of the other research projects that I've been involved in is called the Realities of Academic Data Sharing, where we were specifically trying to understand what the cost for compliance for research data management and sharing policy was at the institutional level. And one of the findings from that study kind of really underscored this point for me. On average, researchers spent approximately like $7,200 for data management and sharing when they shared their data through an institutional or campus repository. This is compared to $35,000 when they used external platforms like generalized data repositories or even specialized websites. And so I think this variation really reflects not only differing choices, but has real financial implications for both researchers and the universities. And so, being immersed in this environment has really clarified the role libraries can play in creating kind of more aligned, predictable experiences for researchers. So.
Great. And Tim, when you introduce yourself, I wonder if you can reflect a little bit on Duke's kind of long history of innovation in this area, especially as you are liaison to the Office of Research and Innovation, and how that may have kind of evolved your views and perspective on this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Tim McGeary. I'm currently the Associate University Librarian for Digital Strategies and Technology at Duke. I've been at Duke for a little more than 11 years. We have significant partnerships between the libraries and the Office of Research that really were had its origin story back in 2016 when the National Science Foundation became more serious about the policies on research data management sharing, and found that we were having some faculty struggling with their data sharing policies and essentially repeating the same data management plans over and over again, and their proposals were being rejected. And so we had an opportunity to create a set of recommendations in partnership with the College of Arts and Sciences to the provost on how to overcome these new policies and support researchers. It just so happened that work was happening in parallel with a research misconduct case that the School of Medicine was working through. And so when the provost accepted a faculty set of recommendations that we helped to spearhead in 2017, we built a research data management team that was able to work in parallel with the creation of the Office of Scientific Integrity, and really start to build parallel services that would work to not only help remediate the effects of that research misconduct case, but also start building some really strong practices on supporting open research practices that really rebuilt the integrity of research at Duke. And so we've been able to use that partnership over between 2017 and 2021 to really establish the libraries as the center of supporting researchers and in research data management practices, and also building in new open workflows for open science, open scholarship, open research. In 2021, the CIO recognized that the research computing still had some gaps to fill, and had surveyed the faculty about what opportunities there were for OIT to be able to build in some new research support services. And after the first year of that survey, recognized actually the gap was broader than just IT, but there were more opportunities for the Office of Research and the libraries to co-partner with OIT in doing this. So we built a new initiative that we call the Compute and Data Service Alliance, and I'll call it CDSA for the rest of the time here, in which we were able to build out some new services for each other and create a communication strategy to say we're going to work on these together and help support each other. Our goal in 2024 was to create or fund this through 1% of our indirect funding, and be able to start creating and incubate some of these new services together. And then, of course, in 2025, when the policy proposals to cap indirects came out, we recognized, well, we can't do that, because taking 1% of our current 61.5% down to 15%, we're certainly not going to get 1% anymore of that. So we really then shifted to thinking as an institution, where do we have opportunities to create direct charging policies for our services? And as you can imagine, that's a pretty significant upsetting of the apple cart of how we've done business. And so that's where we are today.
Thanks. So I'd like to start with this current policy landscape, Gil. And you kind of talked about your time at OMB, where you developed uniform guidance, which is the federal regulatory framework around this. You've been involved with JAG FAIR model development, but I wonder if you can kind of walk us through the kind of current state of federal indirect policy, starting with the 15% cap in February, where the lawsuits stand, what we might expect to hear from the OMB, and where in legislation is the FAIR model.
By the way, thank you, Harriet. By the way, I spent like an hour and a half just discussing that. So that's going to be, I have to really summarize it, crystallize it, watching my time. The current landscape is evolving, and I can pretty much guarantee that, by the time you have your conference next time, the landscape of how library costs are being reimbursed is going to be changed. It has not been changed for years. Since the 80s, the library cost is one of those items that, is automatic, is pretty much included as in the recovery of your indirect costs. It's usually around, 2%, or more, depending on how aggressive you identify the cost and associate it with research. But, it's going to be changed. And the change is due to, a couple of things. Well, first of all, Hilary already mentioned, the 15% rate cap that was proposed by not only NIH, but also by DOE, DOD, and NSF. All those lawsuits, was started in February. At lawsuit ensued, after the proposal, and all four of them are now under permanent injunction, meaning that the HT cannot implement that 15%, in a direct cost rate. Two of them are under appeals. NSF have withdrawn their appeals. They not appealing that the decision by the judge anymore, but NIH and DOD are still in, and DOE is still in there. DOD, you don't know what it is. So in response to that, the JAS in April have convened a group of SME, subject matter experts, and also policy people, and working through the association, to come up with a proposal for a different type of cost model. They basically eliminate, the costs, the indirect costs, or what you call F&A, and replace it, what they call a research performance cost, RPC. And within that, everything's gonna be that used to be included in your indirect cost proposal, gonna get to move up the line and identify on the project by project, basis. So except for one item, which called, the general research operation, which is 15%. Things like, you cannot directly charge or identify to, project. Things like, payroll or human resource, president's office, stuff like that. But everything else is going to be direct charge, developing a rate or an amount and charge to the projects. So library is included in there. It's included what they call a research data information services, and it's going to be identified and direct charge out. So that proposal has been vetted with OMB, has been vetted, with Congress, and has been vetted with all the association. I can tell you right now that, we got a lot of support from Congress. Congress is trying to work some kind of language to put in the appropriation to promote, this idea. I think a couple of days ago, the National Defense Authorization Act, big bill, $900 billion or something like that, include language, that refer to that. So it's got some momentum. We also have that, OMB, and OMB kind of like the idea, that kind of receptive. They like some of the item, they don't like others, but they also mentioned that they are coming up with their own indirect cost model, borrowing some of the attribute from the JAX model. So a lot of things is at the OMB, we heard things, that we heard that that proposal is going to come out October 1st, but then the shutdown happened. 45 days later, now they have to restart. So now we heard that OMB proposal is going to come out, in early of 2026. In the meantime, there are appropriation language that, direct OMB and other agencies to take a look at the FAIR model that we're talking about today. So, it's going to be a reconciliation of both proposal, the FAIR models, and what OMB come out. OMB, when they see that that language in appropriation language, that's require them to take a look at the JAX model, JAX FAIR model, and incorporate in their UG, in the uniform guidance. So it's kind of complicated. It's kind of fluid. It's kind of, I wouldn't say exciting, but it's very challenging, for us. But we need to be ahead of the curve. We need to think ahead, because when it comes out, the OMB going to expect you, the proposal is going to expect you to provide comments, on their proposal. And if you are aware of, all your situation, what lays ahead of you, you can provide very useful comments to OMB before they finalize it. And being 27 years OMB, we do look at those comments very carefully before it is finalized. If 100% people are against something that they propose, they won't go out with it. But it's 50-50, then they can pick, the side, what's best for them.
Thanks, Gail. Just a little bit of follow-up. You kind of mentioned that the FAIR model would reposition library expenses into research, information, and data services, right, which is part of the essential, everyone, research support rather than indirects.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit what that shift could kind of practically mean, like how you might do some calculations, how libraries might want to document some of these things to prepare for that potential eventuality?
It won't turn all of you into account. I promise that, right? Library, you're gonna do library service. You just need help in identify a couple things. So just be just a half a step back on how the current is doing right now. The current uniform guidance, in order to allocate library to research, they have a very simple method called a standard method. It's basically taking the whole library cost and divide it up based on the full-time equivalent. How many researchers you have, how many students you have. In that sense, the amount that allocate or distribute to your based on your student going to be overwhelming, right? 95% or 98%. So in that standards method, most of the library costs going to go to your instruction and very minimal go to research. On the other hand, the uniform guidance also allow you to do what you call, a library cost study. And basically you do survey, you identify the cost, and the cost that attribute, to research is going to be allocated, to library. That's where when I say that the average rate for library component is around 2% for most research intensive university, which their rate is around 60%, let's say, 2% of that, the library cost usually can bring it up to 4% or 5%. And a lot of those costs go back to the library, the amount that we cover by library and go back. So in the FAIR model, you basically have the same thing. Your library costs are there. They own the books, they own the financial. All you need to do practically is, identify all those costs, what are those costs for, identify the cost, identify the services, and then determine the rate. So sounds simple, but, it take a lot of, homework, I would say.
Thanks. Cynthia, Hopkins is facing a pretty significant issue, potentially losing millions because of the funding changes under this potential 15% cap. And you came to Hopkins right when these policy changes were happening. Maybe that can inform a little bit about how you're thinking about these things, because these are kind of happening at the same time, and what existing cost recovery mechanisms or recharging models are you seeing at Hopkins in particular?
Yeah. Thank you. So I think one of the advantages of stepping into Hopkins at this moment is being able to see actually the range of cost recovery mechanisms already operating across the institution. It's not dissimilar from a lot of your institutions and Duke as well. For example, Hopkins has a well-established recharge and service center structures in areas like core facilities, computing clusters, statistical consulting, secure data environments, and these units or these cost centers, they all operate under clear NIH and federal agency compliant rate setting practices. They document actual costs, provide auditable, allocable services that investigators can charge directly to sponsored projects. But we also have institutional precedences in areas like within the library's RJHU data services and research IT special storage tiers, which costs are allocated based on usage and documented effort in those things. I say it's not dissimilar from other institutions. In a recent Scully Kitchen post where we shared out the results of a small survey we did across 30 institutions, 32?
32.
Yeah. Institutions. We shared the results of an exploratory survey, and we found that most libraries are not currently direct charging for general services, but there is an emergent interest, particularly around specialized research data support in areas like systematic reviews, research data services, digital scholarship consulting, where work is really intensive, project-specific, and tied closely to sponsored project deliverables. Through that survey, I just want to point out, while we found many institutions are not currently doing this kind of charging, and some are just starting to think about it, I think one of the biggest takeaways that we found is that libraries want to make the financial and operational costs of their research support activities measurable and more transparent. So understanding where those costs are coming from and making it more visible to researchers was seen as a priority and one of the big takeaways from that survey as well. Really, this transparency and collecting of costs, I think, is a precursor to compliance in many ways. And it gives, again, investigators predictability. It gives research administration documentation and all those things.
Tim, how about Duke? You've got this really strong relationship. What recharge or direct charging mechanisms have you seen at Duke? And perhaps some successes or wins there? And then if you've seen that in the library or even outside the library as some examples.
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, we do have a pretty extensive menu at Duke, depending on which research context you have. The most evident ones have been in the School of Medicine and in the Duke Health System, particularly because as part of the remediation for our research misconduct cases that we were working through, many of those things had to become more transparent to researchers and more accountable, as an institution. So the School of Medicine and Duke Health Technology Services, for example, developed a series of research cores that were much more clear and evident and allowed researchers to choose from those rather than having to take those costs on themselves, which had created a lot of financial efficiency as well as just in institutional capacity efficiency. Likewise, the Office of Information Technology began to work on more of cores for them as well, so that they could be leveraging central resourcing for the university rather than, as you can recall, researchers buying a server and putting it in their lab or putting it in their office or putting it under their desk or a closet that they found somewhere, and really being able to extend those types of efficiencies as well. Related to the survey that we recently did and published on Scholarly Kitchen this week, the Medical Center Library at Duke currently direct charges for all systematic reviews, and they won't perform those if you don't have sponsored research. It's simply just a capacity issue for them, and they recognize that this was the best way for them to recover their costs, but also provide the service to the researchers in an effective way, but also in an accountable way to be sure that researchers were being serious about the systematic reviews that they were inquiring with. So we've used those models to think about what opportunities we can do with the Compute and Data Services Alliance to expand that and think about other opportunities. So we've been in conversation with our research financing group to be doing the work that Gil has been talking about that we need to prepare for or potentially prepare for, depending on what model is chosen by Congress and agreed upon with OMB. And so we have recently built a project management core at the university so that you can now use project managers from the core rather than putting those directly, hiring personnel individually, because that could be very expensive for a grant, allowing grant dollars to go further for other direct purposes. And we are looking at, from the libraries, how we can incorporate our data management consulting program in there. And in fact, the university is starting to consider whether they should require that of every grant, which would really help us in the libraries think about that from a costing perspective. We're actually in the process of doing that now. So even in the status quo model, because that was not part of our previous federal negotiation of our rate, it doesn't fit in the indirect. It was never identified as part of that. And so we can actually add those direct charge now if we so choose. And we're looking at thinking about trying to do that for FY27 or 28.
Staying with you, Tim, you brought something up that I think is on the minds of many. So one of the biggest concerns I hear from library leaders about this is if we move to direct charging, do we risk creating a tiered system where only well-funded PIs can access library services? How do you think about that? And how do you think about ensuring equitable access to our research information services in a direct charge environment?
Yeah, this is certainly a speed bump that we're hitting, particularly as you can think about the emotional and the values-based perspectives of our discipline as libraries. How do we continue to be a campus-centered organization that serves all constituents regardless of their funding? That is certainly a value-driven conversation that we're having and attention in the work that we're doing. To be overly simplistic, there's essentially an administrative separation of charging the cost center for work for sponsored projects and the allocation, and then charging the allocation for work for unsponsored work. That's really what we're trying to move towards, is thinking about that perspective. That requires, administrators like myself and our, chief financial officer in the libraries and our, vice provost to really be thinking about our budget strategies on how we can essentially enable our staff capacity to be able to be responsive to both types of users. So I'm advocating ways that we actually to determine ways to insulate our practitioners as much as possible to say, let's say, for example, 40% of our work is going to be towards sponsored research and 60% of our work is going to be towards unsponsored research and the central core that we've been doing right now. And thinking about how we measure the capacity of these practitioners as the requests grow. And so we get to, let's say, now it's 50-50 in 1 year, and we get to 60-40 sponsored to unsponsored. That's the time for us to invest in new resources so we can rebalance those. And so we don't have our practitioners fully on sponsored dollars that could be, volatile and changing, and therefore we have to think about their, employment in a different way. So we're working towards that goal of creating a balance of funding between the allocation and sponsored research. But that said, I think it's inevitable that we as libraries are going to have to create a menu that fits into that mindset and that structure. And I think it's uncomfortable for us to think about because we've just never done it before. And if you're like Duke, if your library was probably hesitant to even get try to create a cost center because you didn't want to have that kind of, financial methodology in your workflows.
One of the things I like about FAIR is flexibility, and that this is an example of how Duke may start to incorporate that model, but it allows for all kinds of different institutions with different capabilities, different philosophies to be able to apply the principles that fits with their environment. And Cynthia, you've worked with R1s of different sizes. Mm-hmm. So how might you kind of think about these capabilities when the capabilities may be very different from institution to institution? And then also maybe speak to the equity piece and how do we make sure that we can provide our services to everyone, not just funded researchers?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to acknowledge is that it's likely that institutions will not experience direct charging in the same way. Yes. A place like Hopkins has a lot of administrative depth, research volume, and systems maturity to implement more sophisticated models if needed. Smaller institutions, maybe those with less federally funded projects, will understandably probably gravitate towards simpler, lower burden approaches that still allow them to sustain essential research support. So I think that's where the FAIR model is really helpful, honestly, because it was designed with that kind of scalability in mind, right? The simple implementation pathway, like the base level, allows institutions, like smaller institutions or those who choose to recognize like research information and data services in a transparent way without needing to elaborate into tracking systems or service cost centers in the same manner. And I think it still gives visibility to library contributions, which is important. And it provides a mechanism for that kind of cost compliance. And I think in those environments, the priority is not to shift, obviously, like library work onto grants, but again, to make the value and cost of library research infrastructure visible in ways that help institutions make strategic decisions. So even minimal transparency, I think, can go a long way in sustainability. But to the second part of your question, I think it's just important. How do we make sure that direct charging models don't erode equitable access? I think the essential research support, performance support that FAIR model provides, is a really useful model for thinking about baseline infrastructure that every researcher needs. And then like those research performance costs can provide that more specialized project-specific services that can be charged when appropriate. So I think this helps preserve that equity that we're looking for, so that researchers, regardless of funding, retain access to core library infrastructure, such as collections, repositories, whatever you're thinking about in that core area. And then direct charging may only apply to those specialized time-bound work tied directly to sponsored project deliverables kind of efforts. So I think for smaller institutions, making this distinction is kind of even more important. But the hybrid model that we've been discussing and that has been talked about a lot here already is really supportive of that and ensures that researchers are not disadvantaged by access to funding.
May I add something?
Yeah.
So I just going to go ahead and add on that the JAC group that we're talking about is composed of of multiple folks, subject matter expert, and most of them are VPR, vice provost for research. So they know research. And two things they point out is they know how important library costs are and how it have changed. Library have changed in providing more and more services, data storage, cloud computing, all those stuff that they not think about, when the Uniform Guidance was created. More services, they all feel that, this area has been under recover, for research. So that's why, they gave the most flexibility in S area for being the most potentially, the area that, can recover most of the cost for conducting research.
That was my next question.
Oh. That was my next question.
That was my next question.
Okay.
But I do wonder if you can expand a little bit on that, Gil, and share maybe some parallel examples from other types of institutions or departments on campus, and how they might be adapting to different regulatory changes, or how they may be doing direct charging just for their units.
Yeah. So
and how those mechanisms may work.
Yeah.
That we could all learn from.
Yeah. So that makes sense, and this was discussed in our group a lot as well. Library service was never being a direct charge. But other type of activities that, you have all kind of specialized service or service centers that traditionally, again, charge out. When you see a cost, a substantial cost for services that not everybody benefit at the same level, not everybody use at the same level, that's the potential for direct charging. So the typical, the three big things that you always see at universities, animal research facility. Not everybody have animals, so they always have the animal animal research facility as the direct charge. Data center is another one. Computing centers, but you see a typical at university you will also see, like, for example, engineering would have a specific lab that charge out for only a few for people who use it. Or some university, like University of Miami, have a whole fishery departments that you do research on fish, and you develop a rate and you charge out that way. I don't know how many people here belong to a gym. Anybody belong to a gym? Okay, it's good. I want all you guys to raise your hand. All of you have to raise your hand, because that Hilary know that I have to really team quickly out of here because I have to teach a Zumba class at my gym. I'm in the gym at 4 o'clock. Anyway, my analogy, with the specialized services, the gym is there to provide basic services, but they also have, special services. All the equipment, all the bike, all the treadmills, all the Zumba class, yoga class, whatever, you can go there and you pay a fee and use as many times as you want. But if you want to take tango lesson, if you want to do some Pilates, extra Pilates where they have all those torturing machines, right? Or you do the hot yogas and stuff like that, you have to pay extra. So I see, the opportunity for direct charging for library as other as well. Now they're charging for, charging for space. They thinking charging for IRB, the Institutional Research Board that review all those human subjects. Also, for example, clinical trial, you got to develop. For those people who use that, when you develop the rate, you can be transparent, you can be accountable, and you can recover the cost.
So I can share how we're doing that at Duke right now. So as we've been watching the FAIR model develop and thinking about the different models, we have, as part of our CDSA initiative, been thinking about how do we proportion those from a research phenotype perspective. So, while we may not in libraries be able to say how we're supporting animal research in particular, we can say how we're supporting disciplines in particular. And we've been encouraging those in our acquisitions and collection services department to start thinking about how would you break up the collections budget in ways that would actually support the research and research disciplines in this way. And again, it's a very uncomfortable model for us to be thinking about because A, we've never done it before, and B, we haven't thought about the services we're doing from that particular itemization perspective. But we're thinking about that from the services we're doing person to person from a research data perspective. How intensive our research data management services may be to clinical research compared to social science research. We have to think about different rates in that way, and we're starting to come up with models for that.
I thought you were going to add something, or you're going to get up and have us all do Zumba with you. Before we get to questions from everybody, I thought I would ask the same question to everyone here. Basically, regardless whether or not it's fair or some other model, research libraries are going to have to continue to be more visible and accountable and demonstrate our contributions to sponsored research. But do you have advice for these leaders in the CNI community about what they should be doing in terms of partnerships or documentation or piloting things or any other advice that you may have that they could be thinking about now? We'll start with...
You want to start? Yeah. Go for it. Sure. So, given that we've been further along down this road than I would suggest, I believe most have, I would suggest, first off, you think about how you are hiring or leveraging your experienced and highly trained personnel that have the capacity to meet what the expected demand is. That is the first part we're thinking about doing, is how do we position our organization to meet this expected demand? We, as you may have heard, have went through some reductions as a university, and which included every part of the university, including the libraries. And in my vision of how to implement those cuts, I thought about what is the organization I need to carry for the next 5 years, if I can't change it at all. And we were going in this direction. This was part of the direction. The second recommendation I have is leverage centralized infrastructure wherever possible. Don't try to do new things on your own from an infrastructure perspective. Third, to consider direct charges for like published research data sets or things like that. A repository is a must, but it doesn't have to be local, right? You don't have to build it on your own. And so I would, consider thinking about ways to think about those costs and those opportunities. And then for us, when we're, for thinking about how we're setting rates, we are following the Office of Information for Research and Innovation's financial team documentation for all this process. We are not trying to reinvent the wheel. We are not trying to add different rules to that. We are trying to follow that exactly because they're the ones who are going to have to negotiate, and they're going to have to verify, and they have the credibility to have those conversations for us. So we are listening, and we are learning, and we are trying to adapt as much as possible, especially because those are not the practices we followed for, in the past.
So my suggestion would just kind of building off of what Tim talked about is to really think hard about the library services we provide and what may be considered kind of those essential services that should be provided to everyone across the university as a first step. And then to think, well, out of our additional services, what are those that are project-based? And then from that, you can really dig into better understanding the infrastructure, staffing, and overhead costs that might go into supporting those. And so I think in my mind, that's the first step. And that's what we're doing a lot of at Hopkins at this point. Also, with regards to the question about partnerships, I think your research office financial team is a good partner through all of this. I know at Hopkins, I have like a regular meeting with our, we call it CRES, our Committee on Research Enterprise. I forget what the S stands for, but we meet regularly to talk about all these issues that are affecting higher ed research administration. And there's subgroups being formed now to start modeling what some of this may look like if FAIR moves forward, or if we need to move, or what will happen if we move into a 15% overhead rate. And so being part of those discussions is really, really important and critical so that they understand the library costs and expenses, and that our services are taken into account as that moves forward. So partnerships. So yeah, I guess just in brief, partnerships are key. And then also just start thinking about services in some way.
I'm going to address, from a little bit of different perspective and more into, how you adapt yourself to all the regulatory change, and it will change. It's coming. So it's not going to be same old again. I want to reiterate what Cynthia have mentioned before, though. Be aware that the FAIR models does provide a simple option where, you don't have to do, and what that means, though, is for two of those cost components, for library, research data, information services, and the space, you're going to include a 10% of your total cost for that. You don't have to do anything else. And adding that with a 15% for general research operation, you automatically have a 25% that you're going to recover on the total cost of every project. And that's the proposal. So be aware that you do have that option. But if you're going to go with the advanced model, or the detail option, I should say, then there's going to be rules that are going to be changed. So everybody needs to know the rules. Partnerships is important because the cost people, the finance people, are going to know the rules. Pretty much. They need to communicate that back to the library and see what are the allowability, allocability, and how you change the cost. And then you plan for implementation. And by planning implementation, you have to have communication and training. Everybody needs to be on board on how this system is going to work. And then you need to, after you plan the implementation, then you need to set up your system of internal control. That is clearly important. How you self-check against other type of costs that roll in there. How do you develop the rate? Do you develop those rates on an annual basis, on a biannual basis, or some kind of cycle things? And then watch out for the audit. The guidelines for the audit is gonna come out from the federal government in the compliance supplement. If the government is worried about this area, they would have some audit guideline that you can then you can follow. You just make sure that I mean, to get ready for it, it's not a bad idea to do some. I think you are already doing some pilot projects, or kind of identify what currently on your books and what are the potential for identify those type of costs, those type of service, and how you're going to charge out. So pilot projects are, I would say, is advisable at this point.
Thanks. I see we already have questions, but I'm an optimist. And so I just want to invite any of you to share if you, in this news landscape, if you have any hope or optimism about libraries' roles in this situation.
I mean, it's already been clear for us at Duke that we have elevated the library's perspective at the table for how we're thinking about this. And, given, from the context that Gil set up for how long it's been since libraries, charge has even been considered, this is an opportunity for us to really show what the library's impact is to research and how important and central it is for that. So I have a lot of optimism that this is going to continue to benefit us.
+1 to that.
I would say the same thing. I think this area is going to raise the visibilities of how important libraries are, not just to a university, but particularly for the research area.
Great. I think way in the back was our first Nathan question.
Nathan Tallman, AP Trust. As libraries seek to establish direct charges for specialized services, it occurs to me that a marketplace will co-emerge. And is there an assumption that researchers would automatically use these library services when you're planning and playing with the numbers? Because you could have independent researchers, I'll do your systematic review and I'll do it at half the cost. Or what if Johns Hopkins says, we're really good at systematic reviews. Let's start doing it for anybody and charge them. And then suddenly your Duke researchers say, I can get a discount over here, so I'm going to do like that dynamic seems hard to plan for. I'm just wondering how that's affecting the planning. Thank you.
Well, I hear that. I think there is certainly that opportunity and challenge that could present us for that. I will say that as we built our research data management program, the most important and effective communication that we did was with the budget managers of the departments. And so as we were making them aware of what our services were and what opportunities there were to add, the PIs were then followed, were able to follow through that. So they're the ones, they're, a guard to their submissions, right? Everything goes through them before they get submitted. PIs can't really insert anything without them seeing it or without them validating it. So I think that's where some of the important hierarchy of authorization, authentication, and that sort of verification of that work is going to be really important. And then we're going to have to collaborate so that, Johns Hopkins and Duke aren't competing with each other on these things, or that we are able to leverage, each other's services if we become expert in that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think this marketplace already exists in many ways, right? Like we have commercial publishers and other vendors that offer data management and sharing consultations, those things. There is a certain level of trust that working with your own institution provides. And so there's existing mechanisms out there that I think we could leverage. And then, of course, as Tim said, collaboration. And there's examples of that exist as well in our community, either through the data curation network where we do shared staffing and others like AP Trust, where we work with the University of Virginia to help preserve our digital assets and digital collections. So, yeah. Thanks.
Scott.
I'm one of the short ones. Thanks for the panel, especially the last set of suggestions I thought were really on point. Thanks also for the scholarly kitchen post, which I immediately sent to my VPR. But as you move forward, and San Diego State's worked with Attain before, I can't help but notice that the folks on the panel here, they're the biggest, the richest, the most well-resourced. And the comments are, well, what are your recommendations for smaller places? San Diego State has 41,000 students. We did pre-Trump $230 million in sponsored research. We're not a small place, but we don't have anything like the infrastructure that Hopkins and Duke do in this area. And I'm guessing that there are more of us than there are of the types of Duke and Hopkins. And so, and even within CNI, our membership is much broader than the ARLs.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are all going to face these challenges, and we're going to be doing it with far fewer existing resources and in an environment where, as Tim said, new recruits are going to be few. And so I encourage the group as it moves forward to think about diversifying the use cases so that we could really think about how this might play out in different places with different levels of resources, and where the research data management services are delivered by portions of people's time as opposed to dedicated teams. So it was not a question, it was a plea. Thanks.
Scott, thank you. That was really very helpful. And I think we are mindful of our privilege up here for sure. And I think that the simple version of fair is something, if we can socialize that a little bit more and help people understand that landscape, the lift for a library is much less than some of these other more complicated tiered services that we're talking about. But thank you, Scott.
I would just like to say to Scott, it's my turn to use the brain. I was going to say something along those same lines. I was actually going to ask you all about what advice you might give to a library at a university that has been much less resourced. When you were talking about like what you saw as the potential positives to come out of this, I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about is a lot of the services that you're talking about, I have not had the resources to be able to build, and potentially direct cost would allow me to have those resources and build it. And I also really appreciate, Tim, that you acknowledge that this is hard, because hearing you talk about libraries as cost centers is it makes us want to recoil, I think. So I'm asking for your advice about, what you would say to a place that doesn't have the infrastructure that you've already built. And then I just wanted to add one little thing. So when I was at Caltech, I had a success in convincing the provost to help fund some of our collections out of endowments for some of the research centers. And the way that we did that was by demonstrating that researchers in those centers published in and cited particular journals at rates that were not in line with like how many researchers were in that particular area. And so I wonder if there's some of that in thinking about how to expand collections, again, particularly for institutions that are less well resourced. I'm at the University of Missouri, by the way.
So those are great questions and great points. And to also, Scott, thank you. I appreciate for that as well. I'll say a couple of things. One is one of the reasons I really like how the FAIR model is being put together and considering is that it really is, to Gil's point, changing from the perspective of this amorphous blob of indirect charges to really considering the categories of the ways we're doing it. So while there may not actually be any money changing, many real factors in how that is changing, researchers are going to see that line on their budget and say that the libraries are part of what I'm doing. And it's going to be at least a recognition to that. And that conversation will certainly help. And secondly, I don't think the School of Medicine would really appreciate me saying this out loud, but I will anyway. I'm using our misfortune and misconduct case to benefit everyone, right? I see that as an opportunity to say, Duke has had to do this. We've been required to do this. And we are so much better off because we've done this. And let's create models that we can share with others. And whatever scale that proportionally reflects is great. And so I want to be as generous as possible with the work that we've had to do so that it can benefit others as much as possible. And that's why we invest in organizations like the Data Curation Network and say, we want to bring others along. We want to create opportunities for libraries to either create a program or enhance their program or leverage those of us who are larger and well-resourced to benefit themselves too.
I just want to amplify one thing that you said, Tim, which is basically if there is a line item, even if your institution uses the simple method, there is going to be a line item that includes library. And so one thing that I think smaller institutions can do now is build awareness. What is the value of that? What am I getting for that line item? And I think that will go a very long way to work with PIs who may have that question. My 2 cents.
Hi, I'm Sarah Shreves from the University of Utah. So we are in a position where we know exactly how much we get from research overhead from F&A. It funds fully a quarter of our collections budget. So I was really interested, Tim, when you were talking about the sort of how you look at or how you're thinking about talking about collections and doing that kind of analysis, because that's the sort of work we're trying to do now is how do we make this case around collections? We can't, losing a quarter of our budget would be devastating to the research enterprise. And to our students, frankly. So I have that question. I actually have one other question, which is I keep hearing that OMB is not interested in funding the library piece of this. Is that what other people are hearing?
The rolling up library into admin?
Yeah.
Not sure.
Okay.
They probably have all kind of version out there. There was at one time at OMB when I was there to cap the library rate as well and combine with the 26. But there was enough pushback that libraries still outside. Yeah. So there may be some talk, and I can't confirm or deny.
Okay. I just wondered if other people were hearing. But
yeah.
Sorry. Thank you.
And to your first question, I have two thoughts for that. One is, and I may not quote this correctly, but I've been around people who have talked about sort of Koger's advocacy, the fact that, universities have been subsidizing federal research. We are putting much more money in than we were recouping. Mm-hmm. And so I actually think this is an opportunity for, particularly in your case, for you to actually demonstrate that you should get more than a quarter of your collections budget from this perspective, right? That you actually have the data to show that. It's been talked about at Duke that, the 2% we get should fund about half to 3/4 of our collections, and that's sort of how it's been talked. But it's vague, and nobody really knows how that is going, which is sort of to the point of why we should get to a model like FAIR, which is actually making us more accountable and more auditable about the ways that we're using our indirect funds to support our institutions. Yep.
Do we have time for one more?
Okay, briefly. Melissa Rutherford, currently University of New Mexico. I've actually operated 2 NIH cost centers out of libraries before, specifically supporting systematic reviews, and both of them required enormous amounts of subsidization from the libraries and also from our CTSA awards. So I'm kind of curious, if we're really costing out something like systematic review services, it obviously includes our collections, it includes the database subscriptions, it includes ILL, it includes all sorts of things that are kind of base services as well as systematic reviews. But without those base services, we can't do the other ones. So I'm just wondering, from a perspective of libraries who might have to go in this direction, what kinds of things could actually be considered part of a cost charge? Because it's actually really difficult to come up with that. So I've done it in multiple different ways at my different institutions, but it is challenging to think about all of the different components that go into some of these really expensive customized services that we do.
Do you want to do that? Oh, very briefly, because I think we're almost over. Another thing about this FAIR model is it lets you charge for these generalized baseline services, and then should you so choose, you can pull out the more high value services. And then again, I'm going to go back to the simple version. Your university very well may not get into all those details at all and not have service centers for each of these high value services, and they may just apply one amount or percent to every grant.
I would start out small and get every year start take a look in more components. But I would start out with, if you don't have the resource, start out with the simple option and be happy with the 10% and use that time to kind of build up and do analysis on the other type of basically component. I mean, in our group they already identified 10 different components that library service are being provided, and even with the simple option, some of the service that the library are providing now kind of, is out of the traditional library cost. For example, all the requirement for research security. Some of the university library, are in charge of that. Or the cloud computing, stuff of that. It's not the traditional, so you can even use the standard method and do some analysis on those non-traditional library that you can directly have some charge out for it.
Yeah, I plus one on the starting small and thinking about how to build up. So just for example, for us, what we're thinking about for a research data management program, we're thinking of 1 hour consultation for every grant if this is required, if this is a university wants to require it.
Right.
In 2024, that would have been 3,900 hours of consultation. And I don't have 3,900 hours of staff time, for this team. And so that's the university then understands what they have to invest in ahead of time in order to have the capacity to get to that rate. In 2025, it's been about 2,700 grants because of all the cuts and the changes. And so, that also then gives us 2 years snapshot of volatility of what we could be looking at and thinking about how to do that. That's just one piece of, opportunity. And it's a significant amount of money for that one piece of opportunity still.
Thank you all very much. This can be a very uncomfortable conversation, so I'm really glad that you all are engaging with the topic.
Thank you.